Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another breakfast with Blaha. And today I'm having fat-free Greek yogurt, almond butter, and milled flax seeds. Which brings me to my point: dairy. I had someone ask me the other day, like, Jason, you really promote a lot of dairy, but in the past you really didn't. What's going on? And yeah, I've been promoting dairy for years, very heavily. And there's very good reasons for that. In fact, when this topic comes up and we get on the topic of food and meat and animal products, if push came to shove, I think dairy is way more important than meat. And I like meat. I'm very pro meat. I don't eat as much meat as I'd like these days because I focus more, again, on dairy. And because of the way I do my Greek yogurt, I do those whole giant tubs at a time, of course, my protein needs are met. So if I'm just eating meat, it's just for enjoyment to fill in part of my calories when I eat it. It's just not necessary. But we get into the whole question of why dairy. Well, I think some of it's very obvious. Some of it is very clearly obvious. High quality protein. Now, when you say that, people say, well, there's high quality protein in lots of stuff. Yes, that is true, but when we start looking at the highest bioavailabilities, highest quality proteins, dairy tends to win. Now, when we're getting into good proteins, does that probably matter really for muscle growth? Probably not. Essentially what it is that you could probably eat a couple percentages less and get the same benefits. And we need to remember with what's going on with protein intakes and muscle growth isn't just about building the muscles. There's very, very little of the protein that you eat gets turned into muscle tissue. We're talking 1 or 2 grams a day. But we know that higher protein intakes are associated with muscle growth, and a lot of that has to do with what's going on for recovery purposes, repairing tissues all through the body, metabolic purposes. It's actually a big part of it is just recovering from your training. That's a really, really big part of it, and especially even things like connective tissue. So the reasons we find that is more of a recovery end than it is with using the protein itself for muscle growth. But right off the bat, ultra high quality protein. And some of that makes sense, but it's like, well, that doesn't really put a preference towards dairy because we could technically get that from other stuff. You could eat 1/2 of a bite of extra steak and get all your protein and get the same bioavailability. So what are we really talking about? We could talk about some of the trace minerals. I'll get over to what the top 2 things are in a minute. Potassium, magnesium, dairy in general, until we start filtering these things out. And interestingly enough, when people start talking about processing dairy, some of the people who are like, well, you eat all that skim stuff and low fat stuff, it's just really highly refined, but the same people will talk about eating butter and heavy cream or cheese. And look, the more you refine and keep the fat, the actual more nutrition you use. Like most of the stuff that we really want from dairy, you lose it in the fat. The fat doesn't really contain it. So when you start basically removing the lactose itself, not culturing it, but removing it, you actually lose most of the potassium, magnesium, even calcium, B12, and we'll get to those last 2 in a minute. Okay. Lower fat versions actually have a higher concentration of those things. They actually have a higher concentration on a calorie per calorie, it's way higher. So just some context for when you start talking about any sort of processing that you do of milk, right? Is that the more of the fat you keep and remove other stuff, the more the good nutrition you lose. And let's be honest here, milk fat's not a particularly great high quality fat. It's not. It's kind of a different topic. We start talking about why butter is arguably one of the worst fats you can possibly eat in terms of overall health markers. It's what the data shows. Trans fats are probably the only thing worse. But you don't get the same problem in more whole dairy products, but it does equal a lot of empty calories, a lot of saturated fat. Not necessarily ideal. So we can make the case for fat-free versions, which is what I do these days. But I'm not opposed to people eating whole fat versions if they need it to get the calories they need for a while. All right? Probably shouldn't be a lifelong thing, though, to consume large amounts of it. but the overall nutrition that we're getting outside of that. All that potassium, all that magnesium, it is very high in those, and those are things that people are often deficient in. Right? Dairy can easily supply your magnesium needs for a day. Magnesium is one of the biggest deficiencies. But let's get over to the big ones. Calcium. Okay, calcium and B12. Now people say, well, without D3 it doesn't matter. Yeah, well, I tell everyone to supplement D3. First of all, most dairy at the store has D3 added. I tell everyone to supplement D3. It's one of the 2 vitamins you probably should be supplementing no matter what your diet is. Right? D3 and K2. But the calcium. Milk has the highest bioavailable calcium in the world. Right? Any sort of milk or any sort of dairy made from it in which the calcium hasn't been removed, such as something like butter or heavy cream, it's mostly gone. So we're losing the benefits of the dairy at that point. The calcium. Calcium is enormously important for bone health, bone mineralization, and that matters for training. Calcium is important for muscle recovery from training. And that's a big one people forget, right? It matters a lot. Actually, we could argue about the potassium and the magnesium there too. The magnesium from it also, again, we come back over to bone density. But the calcium source, it is king. And it's cheaper to just do dairy than it is to get all these supplements. And that's kind of the funny thing. People say, well, you could get all that from supplements. Yeah, but it's a lot cheaper and tastier to just get it from actual dairy. But the calcium bioavailability, the next one, B12. You'll get this, and when you mention to vegans, for example, well, you guys need to supplement B12 or you're going to cause permanent brain damage. And I'm not joking about that. It's one of the reasons a lot of vegans go completely crazy. It's B12 deficiency. It causes a long-term brain damage. And adding B12 back in isn't guaranteed to fix it. It may be for the rest of your life. It's stupid. All right? Stupid people do these sort of diets long term. They really are. Same thing with carnivore, equally stupid. Both have long-term health consequences. But you set those aside. The B12. But you get vegans who will say, well, a lot of meat eaters are deficient in B12 on their blood work too. It's really common. That's true. But milk drinkers aren't. Because what are our richest sources of B12? It's not all meat. It's red meat specifically, like beef, bison, venison. Those things are loaded with B12. That's one of your top sources, any sort of red meat like that. Equal to it is dairy, unless you filter it out with a process. But like yogurt, from my yogurt every day, I get 4 times the optimal amount of B12. 4 times over. All right, B12, we're lifting. B12 is important for energy metabolism. Okay. We're training. This is critical stuff. Absolutely will impact your training and your recovery. And it'll impact your metabolism over time. All right? B12 is of great value to us, and a B12 deficiency is not going to help you in any way as a lifter or an athlete. This is your source. So we start looking at some of these things that are harder to get in our diet that only have a handful of good sources. What do we get? Calcium, magnesium, B12. All right, these are massive. Dairy is a powerhouse for these. And when you start looking at the sum total nutrition of it, I think we could make the argument that from a training recovery perspective, dairy is going to be your superior protein source. And it's not just because of the protein, it's because of the sum total of what is in it. And that includes things like yogurts and cultured stuff, which again, I'm a big fan of. Yogurts and kefirs, amazing. And they have their own health benefits too, but that's neither here nor there. It's maybe a topic for another video. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.